But greetings to everyone in the audience and greetings to those that are live streaming this morning. We appreciate your attendance, appreciate your interest in studying the book of Daniel. We're in the 7th chapter of Daniel in the 17th verse. Daniel 7:17. You'll recall, maybe possibly from last week, that Daniel received this vision that we're talking about during the first year of the kingship of Belshazzar. Belshazzar was the last king of the Babylonian Empire, and in the first year it was about probably a decade or so before, maybe 16 years before Belshazzar was relieved of his, and in fact was killed by the Medo-Persian regime. But chapter 7 that we're in is a kind of an extension or another view of chapter 2. Chapter 2 talked about that this is repetitious, but that colossal figure that Nebuchadnezzar dreamed about, that colossal figure of a head of gold and silver, of chest and arms of silver, and then belly and thighs of brass, and legs and feet of iron mixed with ivory, with miry clay, and that representation was Babylon, the Medo-Persian Empire, the Grecian, the Macedonian Empire, and the Roman empires. So now these same empires are represented by four beasts. A lion, that is the Babylonian; a bear is the Medo-Persian; leopard, the Grecian or Macedonian Empire; and then this fourth beast was so horrific, so terrible, that it I guess it wasn't represented by an animal. It was just a terrible, it wasn't represented by a known animal. It was just a terrible beast. And so that is kind of the review of the 7th chapter up till the 17th verse. Now in the rest of this chapter, we have some really interesting narrative, and so let's begin with the 17th verse. These great beasts, which are four, and this was Daniel was he had interrupted his vision there, and he had another vision that related to God judging, God on the throne, apparently judging the nations, having control of the nations. And now Daniel sees a heavenly being. He asks this heavenly being about the meaning of this vision thus far. So verse 17 says, "And these great beasts," this is the explanation, "these great beasts, which are four kings, which shall arise out of the earth." And of course, we know what those four kingdoms are. "But the saints of the Most High shall take the kingdom." Now, that introduces this introduces the kingdom established during the Roman rule. Be a kingdom of saints, the kingdom that Jesus came to establish, the kingdom that he continually told his disciples that the kingdom was at hand. And that's not a kingdom of earthly rule. It's a kingdom that is spiritual. It transcends nations, races, ideologies. This kingdom is worldwide, and it's not political. God established at least three institutions: the family, government, and the church. Did God establish any other institutions that we know of? Those are the three, right? And there's a real problem when mankind combines any of these. There's a real problem when church and state, when government and the church commingle. Now, what was the problem of church and state commingling back in history? What was the problem there? Back during the Middle Ages, what was the problem? Of the church and government combining. Pardon me? Well, Sue says that they listen to men rather than God. What's the problem with church and state combining? Paula, what? I didn't hear. Okay. Men establish laws for government, right? Who establishes laws? The laws for the church. Obviously, Christ. Now, we get it all get all out of shape sometimes about a lot of people think of America as a theocracy, and there are those religious groups that are kind of pushing for America being a theocracy. Now, folks, there's a problem with that. And the problem is that the laws of man and the laws of God get commingled and I'm not finding the word I want to use. The law of God commingled with any other laws presents a problem, right? So, this kingdom that God established in the first century was not a temporary thing. Now, Babylon, the rulers of Babylon had the sense that Babylon was so strong that that government would last for ages and ages. Well, it didn't, as Daniel's pointed out here, and as history has demonstrated. But the saints, in verse 18, the Most High shall take the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever and ever, even forever and ever. 19. Then I would know the truth of the fourth beast, which was diverse from the others, exceedingly dreadful, whose teeth were of iron, nails of brass, and devoured and brake in pieces and stamped the residue with his feet. Now, the Roman Empire was this kind of describes the Roman Empire being dreadful. At the time, 2/3 of the population of the world were slaves. Is that about right, preacher? About 2/3? It's suggested in history. 2/3 were slaves. People were chattel. People were just had no rights and whatsoever. But then the Roman Empire gave way to what we might say is eventually papal rule, rule by the government of the apostate church, and that was a problem. That was a bad situation. And then in verse 20, and of the 10 horns. Now we're still talking about this fourth beast, this terrible beast. And of the 10 horns that were in his head. Remember, this terrible beast had 10 horns. And of the 10 horns that were in his head, and of the others which came up, and before whom 3 fell. So this, of the 10, in addition to the 10 horns, another horn came up, which uprooted 3. Even that horn that had eyes, and a mouth that spake very great things, whose look was more stout, than his fellows. Now, whatever this horn represents, and there's a lot of scholarly diversity as to what that horn meant, that horn that came up. Some people or some scholars believe that horn that came up had to do with a Grecian ruler that was, that came up during that Grecian or the Macedonian Empire. And of course, the Macedonian Empire was divided into 4 units related to the 4 generals that Alexander the Great had in his regime. But some people have the idea that horn represented a ruler in the Grecian realm that really was a tyrant against the Jews, and was just a terrible person, particularly to the Hebrew people. Well, other people, and that doesn't make sense, because we're talking here about the Roman regime, you see. Well, so other scholars believe that little horn had to do with something within the Roman Empire, the physical, the state, the government of the Roman Empire. And then others had the idea that this had to do with the apostate the church, and how the apostate church was so terrible for the world and for people in particular. Well, the most plausible is that this little horn, the most plausible explanation is that this little horn that came up had to do with the apostate church rather than the actual Roman rule. Now, Daniel was confused about all this. Now, there's a lot of confusion about this, even as we look back on it. You see, even though we've had the advantage of history playing out over time. And verse 20, and the 10 horns that were in his head, and of the other which came up, before whom 3 fell, even that horn that had eyes, a mouth that spake very great things, whose look was more stout than his fellows. I beheld, and the same horn made war with the saints. Now, obviously, Rome made war with the church, right? Made war with the saints. But the apostate church also made war with believers. Is that right? And of course, during the 1500s and 1600s and 1700s, we see the trend of people coming out of that apostate church, and we call that the Reformation period, and more closely associated with the church, the Restoration movement. I beheld, and in verse 21, let's look at that, and then see how the narrative changes here to verse 22. I beheld, and the same horn made war with the saints, and prevailed against them. Now, his vision then now makes a new twist, and he leaves off the 4 kingdoms and has a view of a heavenly scene. Verse 22 beginning. Until the Ancient of Days came. Now, this war against the saints was devastating until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was given. Well, there's a period here when, now, Ancient of Days, of course, has to do with God, with the eternal nature of God and God as an eternal being, until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was given to the saints of the Most High, and the time came that the saints possessed the kingdom, a restoration or a revival of the kingdom. Verse 23, thus he said, the 4th beast shall be the 4th kingdom upon the earth, which shall be diverse from the kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, and that tread it down and break it in pieces. And the 10 horns in verse 24, and the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings, and shall arise. And another shall rise after them, and he shall be diverse from the first, and he shall subdue 3 kings. Verse 25, and he shall speak great words against the Most High. Now, let's look at in a little detail here at the next clause or phrase here. Rereading it, verse 25, and he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand until a time and times and the dividing of times. Now, there's a lot of confusion among scholars, or a lot of diversity among scholars as to the years, what this means, a time and times, and the dividing of times. And there's so much confusion that it doesn't make sense to me to try to figure out, what some people say this represents 1,260 years. Others say it represents about half that time. and there's just a lot of confusion about that. Verse 26, but the judgments shall sit, and they shall take away his dominion to consume and to destroy it unto the end. Now, and the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdom under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High, whose kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominion shall serve and obey him. So they're talking about the nature of the eternal kingdom. And verse 28, hereunto is the end of the matter. Now, after this explanation, then Daniel was completely understanding, right? Well, let's see what it says. And as for me, Daniel, my cogitations much troubled me, and my countenance changed in me, but I kept the matter to my heart. Now, what's that mean? It was perplexing. After the explanation, it was perplexing in his mind, right? So, then in chapter 8, this was in the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar. Now remember, the events with regard to Daniel in the lion's den, that was an event that was after this narrative. So we take another look at these. We're still looking at the prediction or the prophecy of future nations. Particularly those 4 nations. And so in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, now this was, it's about six or so decades since that his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar had the vision, had the dream that Daniel interpreted. So for 6 decades, Daniel was, dealing with these visions and so on. And Daniel may have had other visions that are not recorded. So, chapter 8 and verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me, Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first. Now, he's going to have another vision. And I saw in a vision, and it came to pass, when I saw, that I was in Shushan the palace, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw a vision, and I was by the river of Eula. Now, whether he was actually bodily in that palace, or whether at Shushan, whether he was bodily present there, or it was a vision that included being there, I don't think we really know. Then verse 3. Then I lifted up mine eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram which had 2 horns. Now, this is new material, of course, but this is looking in depth at something that he's already presented to us about these four kingdoms. So he said, I lifted up mine eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram which had two horns, and the two horns were high, but one was higher than the other. And the higher came up at last. Now, what kingdom do you suppose this represented? Two horns. Yeah. The Medes, the Mede portion of the Mede portion of the Medo-Persian Empire was, a weaker segment of the empire. So now he's getting into detail now about the Medo-Persian Empire.
Bill?
Yes.
I know you know this, but in verse 20, it's going to spell it out for us. It just says, the ram which thou sawest having two horns are the kings of Media and Persia.
Yeah.
I like it when there's not any guesswork, and trying to figure it out. So he tells us who these kingdoms are.
And it's easy. Tim points out that later on in the chapter, it's revealed who these empires. See, we keep coming back. Daniel keeps coming back to more details about these four kingdoms. And as Tim pointed out, the interpretation is plainly given. But even if we didn't have that information, we could figure it out. You see, because of the nature of these, what we know about the nature of these empires. And then he says, I saw a ram pushing. Now, he'd already revealed in his visions previously, it had already been revealed that we're going to have this Babylonian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, the Grecian Empire, the Roman Empire. Now we've got some more in-depth, I guess you'd say, information about this. And I saw, so we have this ram that has two horns, one higher than the other, or this animal. Let's reread this again. Then I lifted up mine eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram which had two horns, and the one's higher than the other. Then he saw a ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beast might stand before him. Neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand, but he did according to his will and became great. Now, this ram was ferocious. This ram was swift. Now, what do we know from history about the nature of Alexander the Great and how he pushed, how he overtook, the Medo-Persian Empire? What do we know from history about the nature of Alexander the Great and how he, by the way, how old was Alexander the Great when he died? Somebody? 33, in these early 30s. Now, think of how much he had accomplished before he died. History indicates that there were, that when there was a battle between the Medo-Persians and Alexander the Great, Alexander the Great had about 50,000 troops, and he defeated the Medo-Persian group in a battle of having 600,000. So, see, this description, you see, bears out in history that we know about. I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beast might stand before him, neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand, but he did according to his will and became great. And as I was considering, behold, an he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground, and the goat had notable horns between his eyes. And it came to the ram that had 2 horns. That's the Medo-Persians, or the Alexander the Great, representing the Macedonian Empire, the Grecian Empire. And then he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran into him in the fury of his power. You know, that Alexander the Great, just in a few years, just took over that area of the world. And I saw him come close into the ram, and he was moved with a choler or anger against him, and smote the ram, and brake his 2 horns. And there was no power in the ram to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. Therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken. And it came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven. Now we've mentioned this before. It's been talked about before in our class, but Alexander the Great had no sons to take over the kingdom. So the kingdom, the Grecian kingdom, the Macedonian kingdom, what was divided into 4 parts, 4 territories, and his 4 generals became head of those particular units of government. Verse 9, and out of one of them came forth a little horn. Out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceedingly great toward the south, and toward the east, and toward the pleasant lands. And it waxed great even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host of the stars to the ground, and stamped upon it. Now he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Now, this gives even greater detail, and we I said a couple of weeks ago that Mark Meadows had a class that was starting to have, or he had a class that we ran out of time, where Mark looked at the history of how the Medo-Persian, or the Macedonian Empire, how that kingdom played out toward the Jewish people, how the Jewish people were affected by the Grecian Empire. They were really the Jews were really affected by this Grecian Empire. How were they affected? Well, in one case, to some extent, the sects of the Jews at the time of Christ had been affected by the so-called Hellenization of the Jewish law. Well, the Macedonian, the Grecian Empire, imposed their philosophy on the nations, you see. And the Jews were affected greatly by, and the Jews were persecuted by the Grecian element. Well, let's go back to yea, in verse 11. Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and placed, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. One of the rulers, or one of the Grecian operatives, was so opposed to Judaism that a hog was sacrificed on the altar at Jerusalem. Am I right, Tim? You know, I mean, it was a terrible time. Certain of these Grecian rulers persecuted the Jews substantially, and I think this has, and we can, we'll get into this a little further later, or a little more later. But yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and place on his sanctuary was cast down. As I said, some of those Grecian rulers were heavily persecuted and forbade. They eliminated some of the Jewish, made it illegal for some of the Jewish religious practices to take place. Verse 12 again, and a host was given them against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. Then Daniel says, then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint, and said unto that certain saint which spake, how long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot? The question there then posed is, how long is this going to take, this persecution? How long is this going to take? How long is this going to be? When is it going to be over? He said unto me, 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. And it came to pass, when I, Daniel, had seen the vision, and sought for the meaning, then behold, there stood before me the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Eula, which is called, and said, Gabriel made this man to understand the vision. So, here we have then, during this period of time, we have, during this vision, we have another heavenly being coming on the scene. Gabriel made this man to understand the vision. So he came nearer where I stood, and where he came, I was afraid and fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, O son of man, for the time of this end shall be the vision. Now, as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep on my face toward the ground. But he touched me and set me upright. Now, you see, we're getting insight into just a segment of this Grecian rule, and we're going to stop there for a moment, and I want to go back to something that I didn't clarify earlier when we were talking about the and I want to be sure I get this into today. I'd like you to turn to the second chapter of 2 Thessalonians. Second chapter of 2 Thessalonians. When we were talking about the apostate church, and I'm sorry I didn't bring this up earlier, but we're talking about during the fourth beast, and I want to clarify this before we go further in chapter 8. The Apostle Paul has said something very explicit about what was going to happen in the future, and he said this to the Second Thessalonian, or in 2 Thessalonians. He said, "Now we beseech you, brethren." There was some controversy in the Thessalonian church about the future, of the kingdom, and now we beseech you, brethren, by the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ, and by our gathering together unto him, that ye be not soon shaken in mind or trouble, neither by spirit, nor by word, nor by letter, as from us, as that day of Christ is at hand. They had some idea that that Jesus was going to return very quickly in their generation, and Paul says to them, "Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there were a falling away first, and that the man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition." Now, before you see, Paul says there's going to be a son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Now, history reveals to us, and we just know that from our study of history, that the apostate church, there arose people in the apostate church that claimed to be, and to some extent still claim to be, in place of God, even to the extent of making laws with regard to the matter, religious matters. "Remember ye not that when I was yet with you, I told you these things, and now ye know what withholdeth, and now ye know," in verse 6, "what withholdeth, that he might be revealed in his time. For the mystery of iniquity doth also now work. Only he who now letteth it will let, until he be taken out of the way." And then and he continues there in verse 8, "And then shall that wicked be revealed, whom the Lord shall consume with the spirit of his mouth." And so, I realize we're out of time here, but the bottom line is, Paul, with regard to that little horn, Paul gave us some explanation about this. So I apologize that I didn't bring that up previously, but I wanted to inject that before we went on. Thank you.